Welcome to the third part of the ongoing series I have discussing the causes of the mass extinctions throughout Earth's history. Today, we are exploring the Devonian period, sometimes known as the Age of Fish. This was a turbulent time, largely known for the impressive diversity of fish, but it suffered a series of extinction events, culminating in the second of the Big Five mass extinctions. Don't worry if you missed the earlier parts, this video stands on its own. But if you're curious, check out the playlist on my channel for a complete exploration of Earth's mass extinctions. You'll find a document with sources for images and research papers I used in the video description down below. So, what was the Devonian period? It was the period of the Phanerozoic Aeon that spanned the 60 million years from the end of the Silurian period to the start of the Carboniferous period. It lasted from around 419 million years ago to 358 million years ago. It was named after Devon, the English county where rocks from the period were first studied. Let's start with fish. As I have already said, the Devonian is sometimes known as the Age of Fish. This is due to the incredible diversity of jawed fish during this time. Cartilaginous fish, like early sharks, exploded in abundance, and the heavily armored placoderms were at the top of the food chain. Lobe-finned fish, the ancestors of land-based vertebrates, started to diversify into forms to take more advantage of the terrestrial biome, although this transition would not be completed until the Carboniferous. Fish were not the only lineage thriving in the oceans of the Devonian. Trilobites and brachiopods, organisms those who have seen earlier videos in this series will be familiar with, were still well established, and the massive coral reefs from the Silurian were still present in the Devonian. New lineages also emerged, such as the first ammonites. However, life was no longer restricted to the water. Despite being known as the Age of Fish, the Devonian saw the massive diversification of life on land. Terrestrial plants and fungi exploded rapidly in an event known as the Silurian-Devonian Terrestrial Revolution. This had a significant impact on the planet, altering the composition of the Earth's crust and driving changes to the water cycle and the global climate. As with the explosion in animal diversity during the Cambrian period, this sudden diversity in plants led to many highly experimental forms as they tried to establish various niches and outcompete their competition. There was severe competition for space, sunlight, and nutrients. In particular, vascular plants grew tall and developed expensive canopies to make the most of the available light. While this might give you the impression of a modern forest, the Devonian forests were extremely different. Most of the plants were spore-bearing, and so more similar to ferns than they were to any of the trees we are more familiar with today. The emergence of plants was accompanied by a massive radiation of terrestrial invertebrates, especially arthropods, many of which co-evolved with plants to form symbiotic relationships. These early terrestrial animals would focus on eating plants, seeds, or detritus, and so this early life on land was fully dependent on the terrestrial revolution. Hexapods, and especially insects, were one of the most diverse of these terrestrial animals, but the first land snails and slugs also emerged, along with, as we discussed earlier, some of the earliest tetrapods. I hope this short description gives you some grounding in the world we are exploring in this episode, ready for the extinction events to come that were, once again, about to change life on Earth forever. The Devonian experienced many minor extinction events. Over 20 have been formally described, so I am not going to cover all of them. For this, let us just look at the Eemsian stage. This was part of the early Devonian, and it lasted for around 14 million years, from 407.6 million years ago to 393.3 million years ago. The Eemsian is largely known for the significant geological changes that occurred within this relatively short time span. But we're focusing on extinctions. So the Eemsian began with the Lower Zlykov event. This minor event is largely associated with the extinction of a large lineage of graptolites. Graptolites are filter-feeding colonial animals that first appeared as early as the Cambrian period. There are still a few species of graptolites alive today, although with only 5 species they are a mere shadow of the diversity they enjoyed in the past. The Lower Zlykov specifically affected the graptoloids, that is, graptolites in the order Graptoloidea. Unlike other graptolites, graptoloids were free-floating and planktonic. They were particularly important index fossils during both the Ordovician and Silurian periods. An index fossil is a species or group that are useful indicators of a particular span of time. Graptoloids were frequently mentioned in the previous video on this series, as they were also impacted by earlier extinction events. But the Lower-Zlykov event is often considered the beginning of the end for this previously successful lineage. Many species went extinct, severely reducing the diversity and abundance of graptoloids. Some graptoloids did manage to survive into the early Carboniferous period, but the Lower-Zlykov was the start of their slow decline throughout the remainder of the Devonian period. An interesting thing about the Lower-Zlykov is that it is only well documented as having affected graptoloids. Other marine organisms were likely impacted too, but there is little evidence of this in the fossil record. So what actually was the cause of the Lower-Zlykov? To be honest, it is not entirely clear. It is believed to be linked to significant environmental changes, with fluctuations in sea level being the major factor. As far as I can tell, other effects are largely speculation, but may have included a change in climate, low levels of oxygen in the ocean, or increased sedimentation. The thing with these suggested causes is that they must not have been too severe, or there would be evidence of it affecting more than just the graptolites. For example, low oxygen was a major cause of the Cambrian Ordovician extinction, which led to the extinction of 60% of marine organisms. It was also a major factor during the Ordovician Silurian event, which is the second largest mass extinction known in the Earth's history. We don't see anything comparable during the Lower-Zlykov, so if it was a factor, then it was nowhere near on the scale or severity that these past events experienced. The Lower-Zlykov may have been catastrophic for the graptoloids, but it also saw the emergence of a new lineage, the Goniatites. This is a genus of coiled cephalopods, which were some of the earliest ammonites. They would become important index fossils themselves in later periods. Continuing through the Eocene, we pass through the Upper Zlykov event. This one is actually not an extinction event, so I will not spend a lot of time on it. Instead, it was an event that saw the progressive rise in sea levels during the middle of the Eocene stage, about 400 million years ago. This would clearly have a rather massive impact on many marine ecosystems. While not considered a mass extinction event itself, it was the prelude to the next one, the Delayha event. The Delayha is the event that marks the conclusion of the Eocene stage, around 400 to 397 million years ago. The exact period of time this covers has been widely debated, with some scientists going so far as to combine the Lower-Zlykov and the Delayha into a single event that persisted throughout the Eocene stage. Most distinguish between them, much as I have here, but this is not universally accepted. The Delayha event, sometimes known as the Delayha cancellata event, is an unusual event in that it was an extended period of faunal turnover, where some species disappear but new ones arise. For example, the Goniatites, which, as I have mentioned, only recently emerged, did have some species go extinct, but new ones started to appear. This led to the gradual change in marine communities throughout this event. While the sea level changes that occurred during the Upper Zlykov was a major factor in this event, there are other known changes that happened around this time. For example, patterns of sedimentation changed, with more clay-rich sediments being deposited. These would have all contributed to environmental stress during this time, leading to the observed faunal turnover. While I am using the Eocene stage as the exemplar for discussing minor Devonian extinctions, many of similar events occurred throughout the Devonian, but as you can see, these were relatively localized, only affecting small areas or specific lineages of organisms. However, let's skip right over these minor extinctions to the next one of significance. This brings us to the Titanic event, sometimes known as the Titanic Unconformity or Titanic Crisis. This occurred during the middle of the Devonian period, about 386 million years ago. This event was triggered by a period of global warming, which resulted in lowering the dissolved oxygen content in the oceans. This might seem like an odd association, but there are actually many ways that warmer waters can lead to less oxygen. I should stress that these following examples are not all confirmed to have occurred during the Titanic event, but they are known ways in which warm temperatures can negatively impact the level of dissolved oxygen in waterways. To start, warm water simply holds less oxygen than cold water can. On top of this, when the surface water is warmer, it will mix less with the colder deep waters. Surface water is more oxygen-rich than deeper waters, so if mixing between the two is reduced, then oxygen depletion in the already oxygen-poor deep waters is accelerated. Warmer temperatures can change weather patterns, leading to more frequent and intense storms. How does this affect life in the oceans? Well, it increases nutrient runoff, which increases nutrients in the oceans. Increased nutrients can then lead to eutrophication, and so cause massive algal blooms, further depleting the available oxygen. Finally, warmer temperatures can negatively affect the growth and productivity of phytoplankton. As one of the major ways of replenishing dissolved oxygen in the water, the reduced phytoplankton activity has a major impact on the level of available oxygen. Alright, so that explains why the oxygen levels were reduced, but what was the effect on the life at this time? Well, it was not small. 50% of coral genera worldwide went extinct. Tabulate corals and rugose corals were hit especially hard. Both of these groups are now extinct, but tabulate corals were notable for their hexagonal structures. They were almost always colonial, but rugose corals had both solitary and colonial species. As an ecosystem engineer, this massive loss of corals severely reduced habitat for animals reliant on coral reefs. So this had a cascading effect throughout many other lineages. Brachiopods, sea sponges, ammonites and bryozoans were all severely impacted. As you might notice from this list, the Titanic event largely affected invertebrates. It is believed that vertebrates escaped largely unscathed due to the localization of the Titanic event. It was focused on corals and the invertebrates living in the coral reefs. Most vertebrates have much more mobility and so did not rely as heavily on the reefs. Fish were still early in their evolutionary history, and so were likely much more adaptable to the changing conditions. We are now approaching the end of the Devonian, which brings us to the end Devonian extinctions. This is one of the big 5 mass extinctions, as proposed by Raup and Sepkoski in 1982. This makes it one of the most devastating losses of life in the Earth's history. The end Devonian extinctions has 2 separate pulses, though they are usually grouped together. First was the Kilvasa event, marking the boundary between the Frasnian and Famennian, about 372 million years ago. This was then followed by the Hangenberg event, at the very end of the Devonian period, about 358 million years ago. While this might make it seem like the end Devonian extinctions lasted 14 million years, this is definitely not agreed on by everyone. The problem stems from considering exactly what counts as a mass extinction. Some argue only the Kilvasa event should be included, while others argue that a longer period of disturbance, including many smaller extinctions, is a pattern that combined to form a much larger event. This leads estimates of the length of time of the end Devonian extinctions ranging from 500,000 years to 25 million years. Let's leave the arguments and focus in on the Kilvasa event. As we have already seen, the Devonian was a turbulent time for marine organisms, with fluctuations in sea levels, oxygen content, and global temperatures causing havoc in the oceans. These are believed to have continued to the end of the Devonian period, meaning that they likely also contributed to the Kilvasa event. Starting with temperature, the Kilvasa event coincided with a period of global cooling, in contrast to the Titanic event. The cooling is believed to have been due to lowered levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, both from the increase in terrestrial photosynthesizing plants and the weathering of silicate rocks. This led to the beginning of the late Paleozoic Ice Age, which persisted from the late Devonian all the way through the Carboniferous and into the late Permian periods. This cooling could have altered ocean currents and would have reduced the suitable habitats for many species. Global cooling would also have another effect, and that is the lowering of sea levels due to ice caps forming at the poles. This is believed to be another major cause of the extinction seen during the Kilvasa event, with many marine habitats disappearing. The lack of oxygen in the oceans is believed to have continued and worsened due to nutrient runoff and eutrophication, as I described during the Titanic event. This leads us back to the expansion of terrestrial plants. Plants increase the weathering of rocks as their roots accelerate this process. This increased weathering would have increased nutrient runoff, leading to the eutrophication and lowered oxygen of the oceans. There are signs that the Kilvasa event also coincided with increased volcanic activity. If this was the case, then the gases and ash released would have caused ocean acidification, placing further stress on the marine organisms. Times of increased volcanic activity are usually associated with global warming due to the release of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. However, this was a period with global cooling. This does not preclude the possibility of volcanic activity, however. While volcanoes do release greenhouse gases, they can also release sulfur dioxide, which have a very different effect. Instead of trapping heat, like carbon dioxide does, when combined with water vapor, sulfur dioxide forms sulfate aerosols. These reflect sunlight and so cause cooling. This effect is typically more short-term than the warming experienced with greenhouse gases, but when combined with other things happening during the late Devonian, in particular the massive expansion of terrestrial plants and algal blooms in the oceans, it is possible the carbon dioxide expelled from volcanic activity was not enough to counteract the cooling effect. One last factor that is sometimes proposed as contributing to the Kalvasa event is an impact from a comet or other extraterrestrial object. Honestly, at this point, I just think scientists like blaming extinctions on asteroids. Most extinction events seem to have at least a few people suggesting asteroids as a possible cause. That is not to discount it entirely, it is just a trend I'm starting to notice. Anyway, for the Kalvasa event, some people point to the Silion Ring, an impact crater known to have occurred during the Devonian. The Silion Ring is one of the 15th largest known impact craters on Earth, so it would not have been a small event. Asteroids and meteors certainly can have a large effect on life, even those not near the impact site, due to the resulting dust blocking out the sun for years. While it used to be believed that the Silion Ring's formation was around the time of the Kalvasa event, more recent advancements in dating techniques have pushed the actual date of the event to several million years later, about 371 million years ago. This means it was definitely not a primary cause of the extinction, although the extra environmental stress it would have caused would certainly not have helped the species surviving the Kalvasa event to recover. Alright, we've talked a lot about the potential causes of the Kalvasa event, but what was the actual effect? It largely impacted shallower marine environments, and especially coral reefs. The Titanic event may have caused the loss of some coral reefs, but the Kalvasa event caused the almost total collapse of coral reef ecosystems worldwide. The giant calcite-based reefs of the Middle Devonian almost disappeared, and after the Kalvasa event, the remaining reefs were silica-based, composed of an entirely different lineage of corals. This transition was so severe that reefs would not regain their Devonian extent until the Mesozoic era, 1 to 200 million years later. Of course, the Kalvasa event did not only affect corals, many invertebrates were also severely impacted. Cystoidea, a lineage of echinoderms, completely disappeared at this time. Trilobites, graptolites, ammonites, and brachiopods all lost many families and genera. Although vertebrates, conodonts were also heavily impacted. In total, the Kalvasa event is responsible for the loss of 19% of families and 50% of all marine genera. This is a huge loss in biodiversity over a relatively short length of time. However, it was confined mostly to the marine invertebrates. Aquatic vertebrates and the burgeoning terrestrial fauna and flora appear to have been mostly unaffected. Up until this point, vertebrates in general had managed to escape the many extinction events throughout the Devonian, but this was about to change. The other part of the end Devonian extinctions was the Hangenberg event, sometimes known as the Hangenberg Crisis. As I said before, this occurred at the very end of the Devonian period, about 358 million years ago, and marks the transition from the Devonian and into the Carboniferous. Some of the causes we discussed with the Kalvasa event are still relevant here. Low oceanic oxygen levels, global cooling, and volcanism were still very impactful conditions that organisms were dealing with at this time. There were, however, some other conditions that may have contributed to the loss of life. Let's start with glaciation. This may appear to be the same as global cooling, but glaciation is a related but separate phenomenon. Glaciation specifically refers to the formation of glaciers and ice sheets. It often results from global cooling, as it did during the end of the Devonian period, but it has a drastic effect on the sea levels. During the Hangenberg event, this was far more pronounced than the cooling that occurred during the Kalvasa event. The next possible cause of the Hangenberg event is euxinia. This is the increase of hydrogen sulfide in the oceans, contributing to the lack of oxygen. There are several things that might have caused this. We've already talked about nutrient runoff, sea level changes, and volcanism, but all of these could be the culprit. Another suggestion is that there is evidence of wildfires during this time, which may have contributed to the nutrient runoff. The last factor I'm going to cover that may have contributed to the Hindenburg event is a supernova. This is a relatively recent suggestion, with research on it being first published in 2020. It has been suggested because malformed plant spores from this time suggest that there was an increase of UVB radiation and depletion of ozone from the atmosphere. This hypothesized supernova would have exploded in the vicinity of Earth, causing massive damage to the ozone layer and showering the Earth in excess radiation from the Sun. There is no direct evidence for this theory, and it has been criticized by some as too slow to cause the observed extinction event. And it is possible that the depletion of ozone could have been caused by the volcanism. Alright, so now we understand a bit more about the causes, as vague and unknown as they are. What was the actual observed loss of life during this period? It is estimated that 70 to 80% of marine invertebrates went extinct at this time. We may as well start with the reef-building organisms. Already ravaged by the Killvasa event, they disappear entirely from the fossil record for the next 10 million years. The Hindenburg event also decimated calcimicrobial reefs which had been untouched by the previous extinction events. Ammonoids were nearly wiped out, with almost 90% of species dying. Less research has been done into other mollusks of this time, such as nautiloids and gastropods, but they are thought to have been significantly impacted as well. The only two orders remaining of trilobites were severely affected, and one of which was entirely eradicated. The other was able to survive and rapidly diversify during the Carboniferous. Crustaceans like ostracods were also affected, and some groups died out. At least 50% of ostracods went extinct, but they again diversified following the crisis. Plankton was another group that suffered severe losses. The few that survived were low in diversity and small. The Hindenburg event not only affected invertebrates, however. Conodonts were jawless vertebrates that had been prevalent since the Cambrian period. 40% of deepwater conodonts died out, but in some areas this was as high as 72%. 50% of shallow water conodonts also went extinct at this time. It has also been suggested that the Hindenburg event caused the extinction of several lineages of agnathans. Agnathans are jawless fish, but the only ones still alive today are the lampreys and hagfish. They used to be much more common and diverse, but were declining even before the crisis. The Hindenburg event caused the extinction of most remaining lineages of them, cementing the dominance of jawed vertebrates. Now we need to talk about the placoderms. These were armoured, jawed fish that first appeared during the Silurian. However, they characterized the fauna of the Devonian period in their role as apex predators. They were one of the first jawed fish, and are believed to be the first vertebrates with true teeth. However, this abundant, diverse, and successful lineage of jawed fish were completely wiped out during the Hindenburg event. Sarcopterygians, the lobe-finned fish that gave rise to terrestrial vertebrates, were also severely affected. While terrestrial vertebrates obviously survived, none of the known tetrapods from the Devonian survived into the Carboniferous. However, this is likely more a result of the poorly known fossils of these groups, and they were likely not as severely affected as other groups. This is actually a topic I will return to in the next video in the series, when I discuss Romer's Gap. The last group I haven't mentioned is the plants. The flora of this time had low diversity, and was dominated by giant Archaeopteris tree-like ferns. However, during the Hindenburg event, Archaeopteris were mostly wiped out, and many other previously abundant species were also severely impacted. This is how the Devonian period ended. Much like the Cambrian and the Ordovician periods before it, the Devonian ended with a climactic mass extinction that affected all life on Earth. While the causes are poorly understood, the impacts are clearly seen in the fossil record. With the loss of the placoderms, Archaeopteris, and the extensive coral reefs, life following the Devonian would never be the same again. The Devonian, in general, was a turbulent period of time with many minor extinctions, but the end eclipsed any of the small events that came before. I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next installment of our series on mass extinctions, we'll venture into the Carboniferous period to explore the largest known extinction of plants. Next week, we'll return to one of my channel's more standard videos with a deep dive into one of the only eusocial vertebrates. Thank you for listening, and please share your thoughts on this topic in the comments below.